Israeli leaders insist they will not allow Iran to get a nuclear weapon. For years, the overshadowing question has been whether Israel would take preemptive action to cripple or destroy the regime's nuclear program. CBN News talked with one Israeli analyst who has studied the question for more than a decade. In 2012, Yaacov Katz, now the editor-in-chief of the Jerusalem Post, served as the paper's defense analyst. As co-author of Israel versus Iran, The Shadow War, he examined the potential for an attack on Iran's nuclear program.
It seemed at the time that Israel was capable of doing it. I distinctly remember one meeting that I was brought into at the Air Force headquarters in Tel Aviv with the top Air Force general who basically laid out, rolled out a map on a table and showed us how the Israeli Air Force squadrons would fly to Iran.
At the time, Israel prepared night and day.
The Air Force had been training extensively for this operation. Billions and billions of shekels had been poured in to this planning and to training and to buying up the munitions and the technology and the weapons that would be needed to take out some of the facilities.
Then Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and Defense Minister Ehud Barak tried but failed to convince the cabinet, army and security chiefs to take action.
In the end, that never happened. So that was the backdrop back in 2012. And it seemed real, it seemed viable, and it seemed like Israel had a real opportunity to cause enough damage to set back Iran's nuclear program.
Now, 10 years later, the problem and targets remain the same. Natanz, Iran's main uranium enrichment facility. Fordow, with thousands of centrifuges burrowed into a mountain. To the west, Iraq, where a heavy water plutonium facility is under construction. And further south, Iran's uranium conversion facility in Isfahan. Since this scenario hasn't changed in 10 years, what about Israel's military capability?
Israel today, Chris, is stronger than it was back in 2012, right? If back in 2012 we had F-15s and F-16s, those are fourth generation fighter jets that are detectable on radar. Today we have F-35s. These are the JSF, the Joint Strike Fighters, that have stealth flight capabilities that can basically go fly into enemy airspace, not be detected, and can take out radar installations as well as surface-to-air missile systems, can basically pave the way for then the big heavy bombers, the F-15s and the F-16s, to come in and drop a ton of munitions all over these different facilities to destroy them.
The question a lot of people have been asking over and over again throughout the years, can Israel do it?
Well, I think it's a little more complicated today, Chris. I think that back in 2012, the feeling was that yes, it could do it. Then Iran's nuclear program is not as advanced as it is today. It was not as heavily fortified as it is today. It was not as dispersed as it is today. With that said, even then, it would have been just causing enough damage to set them back for a period of time.
Middle East expert Joel Rosenberg laid out a number of top stories to look at in 2022. At the top of the list, an Israeli attack on Iran.
We've never had to do it before. We've always found a way through covert operations and all kinds of other shadow activities to keep Iran from getting the bomb without having to go to what's called a kinetic war, a full-on actual war.
Katz points out even if there were an attack, it wouldn't be the end of the story.
And I think that no one has any illusion to believe that if Israel attacks Iran, that's it. There's never going to be a nuclear program. No, there can be, because the Iranians have the domestic know-how, they have the technology, it's in their heads. And while you can destroy their facilities and infrastructure, you can't take away that knowledge.
Plus, any military move likely leads to a regional war, with Iran unleashing Hezbollah, its arm in Lebanon, to fire thousands of missiles into Israel.
That is not a war we want to be in. We might have to do it, but I mean, those stakes are just so high, and I think that's the far away the biggest story.
I think that Israel has means at its disposal. The question, though, comes down to, is it worth it? Is the damage that you will cause Iran's nuclear infrastructure going to be worth the war that will ensue, the international condemnations that you will almost definitely face from the world?
It's an age-old dilemma that now faces a new set of Israeli leaders.
I don't think Israel can live with a nuclear Iran, right? I think a nuclear Iran has the potential to pose an existential threat to the state of Israel. So it's not like I'm saying we should just sit back and let this happen. No, we have to do what we have to do, but we also have to realize that sometimes power has its limits. So it's complicated.
As Israeli military and political leaders increasingly warn about a looming attack, Rosenberg believes Israel's options are running out.
I don't hear it as hyperbolic. I don't hear it as trying to be sensationalistic. I think Israeli leaders are realizing this is it. Iran has gone past all of the previous red lines that any Israeli government has ever said. But no Israeli prime minister wants to go to war.
The threat, sadly, is still there, and it needs to be dealt with. I would hope and pray that it can be dealt without the use of force, without the need for war and bloodshed. That is always the Israeli and Jewish preference, right? Is to be able to do this through peaceful means, through dialogue, through discussion, through a deal. But unfortunately, we are dealing with a murderous regime that has so much blood on its hands that it's only seeking and hungry for more. And that's why it needs to be stopped.
And another part of history also remains, as Katz points out, often the Jewish people stand alone.
That famous saying of Hillel the Elder, a Jewish scholar from the period of the Talmud from a couple thousand years ago, who said back in the time in Hebrew, "Eina nidli mili," which translates into English, if I am not for myself, who will be for me? And what was true thousands of years ago for the Jewish people is still so true in the year 2022.